Welcome to the Organ Podcast from the Royal College of Organists with me, Mark O'Brien. Coming up, I explore a four-manual Harrison and some musical heritage at the West London Synagogue. Now that sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
That's a jolly version of...
The God of Abram Praise, that's right. Yes.
Now, hang on a bit, wait. Now, have you pinched that from the Anglicans, or what?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the name of it in the New English Hymnal is called Yigdal. So I think it was the other way around. I think that the Anglicans pinched it and sort of anglicised it a bit.
So that's an original Jewish melody that is going the other way into the Anglican Church.
That's right.
And that's with the Director of Music at the West London Synagogue, Richard Hills. But first... I'm sitting in a lovely little park right opposite the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, here in the centre of London. This is the UK's leading hospital that is dedicated to the diagnosis, treatment and care of all conditions that affect the brain, spine and nervous system. And the reason I'm here is because inside this hospital is a pipe organ that has recently been restored, having fallen silent for a number of years. Now, there's a lovely story behind its restoration, but also quite an important ambition that this organ could play a part in music therapy and wellbeing for both staff and patients. Two people are key to the restoration of this instrument. One is Christopher Batchelor, who is an organist and a patient here, and the other is Diana Scarrett, who, as chair of the Friends of University College London Hospitals, has played a crucial role in the funding of this restoration alongside the National Brain Appeal.
Well, it was an accident, really. Like all charities, we're on the lookout for useful things to do, and we wondered whether something could be done in the chapel. We were wondering about some of the leaks in the roof, which have been mended just recently. But we came across this organ sitting at the back of the chapel, not played, silent, not for years, you know.
I mean, you were literally just looking for something to, and stumbled across, unexpectedly, a pipe organ in the middle of this hospital.
Yes. So I've got a friend who had just been involved in a big organ restoration project in Islington, and she said, "Oh, well, if you're interested in organ restoration, you need an expert. You need to get in touch with." And she gave us this name, Christopher Batchelor, because he'd advised her. So she gave me his email address, and I sent him an email. And almost within minutes of getting the email, he phoned me, and he said, "Oh, yes. Well, I'm in Queen Square just at the moment. I'm just outside the hospital. Where is this organ? I'm going to have a look at it." And he did. And he said, "Well, it's a really interesting organ." And everything really followed from that. He wrote a paper about it for us. He helped us get estimates of how much the work would cost, advised us on who ought to do the work. And it's all down to Christopher, really. None of this would have happened without him.
And here is Christopher playing some Hindemith on the newly restored hospital organ. Now, Chris has a huge pedigree when it comes to the pipe organ. For 7 years, he was managing director of Harrison & Harrison. He's been president of the Institute of Organ Building, as well as being founder and artistic director of the London Festival of Contemporary Church Music and director of music at St Pancras Church in London. But in 2012, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and since then has been a regular outpatient receiving treatment at this hospital. Well, Chris, you've been involved in the hospital here for a number of years. You volunteer. You also have your treatment for Parkinson's here in this hospital. Why was it important for you then to get involved with the restoration of this pipe organ? Because I think it's been out of action for a number of years.
It has been out of action for a number of years indeed. And it was a great shame to have this sitting there in the corner, not doing anything. So we made a lot of effort, a lot of success as well in raising money to move this along. It is very important to me. I'm an outpatient here, an inpatient, a volunteer, and I was diagnosed with Parkinson's about 12 years ago. And there's no stopping it; it's going to carry on. But a question of how quickly it gets going, you know.
That must have impacted in the way that you play the organ.
Yes, it does. If it's cold, if temperature is too low, I can't play. Simple as that.
What, your fingers seize up, or is it just the dexterity that you want isn't there? How does it manifest?
It's the whole load of things. Dexterity is one thing, agility, all those things. So I sort of try and also base my medicine around that as well.
You come here as a volunteer. I think I'm right in thinking you actually play in the chapel while people are working, patients and staff are coming in and out.
Well, we're beginning to find out how loud this organ is around the hospital. People come in and say...
You mean people can hear you in the wards when you're on full organ?
I want to know really if they do. At the minute, it's just people who are down here.
Yes. Well, the organ is a small 4-rank extension organ built in the 1930s by Robert Spurden Rutt and is even on the British Institute of Organ Studies' historical organ listing scheme. But you'd be forgiven for thinking there's no organ here at all, as all the pipes are hidden behind a grille built into the wall, quite possibly not to interrupt the very elegant Art Deco design of this chapel.
This organ in particular is very important. It shows you don't get many organs by Spurden Rutt.
Robert Spurden Rutt, I've never heard of him. I mean, that doesn't mean much, but is he a London firm, really, is he?
Well, yeah, he's East London, really.
Is he any good? I mean, how would you describe the organ? Because with the one we're looking at now, it's a 2-manual console. It's got about 23 stops.
It was built at a time, 1938, when it was the in sound. You've got strings here, you've got trombas, diapasons here. This is all what you'd expect on a much bigger organ, say King's Cambridge.
So a romantic sound.
Oh yeah, definitely.
That's what he's after here.
He's definitely after that, and he gets it. That typical romantic sound, which is much to be admired.
What are the key characteristics you think best sell this organ now it's been restored?
Well, on one hand, I'd say swell strings.
It's nice, warm.
Yeah, it's great.
But here in this location, where it is in a hospital, and you've been here for a long time, you've been involved in it, is there a case of the organ perhaps having a different relationship with you in the fact that rather than being frustrated that you can't do things that you used to be able to do, that perhaps there are now new emerging therapeutic benefits to playing the organ? Is that true?
I think that's very nicely put, actually, yes. I think the organ will be quite a thing of the future here. And so we want to get together with the music therapists who are on the UCL site. Patients will want to come in here. Not only patients, family and friends who might be very stressed as well. And they come in as well, hopefully. And some nice gentle music in the background, very light.
Well, following on from Chris's idea of having the right kind of music to play for staff and patients at this hospital, what actually is the potential for this organ to play a therapeutic role? I spoke to consultant neurologist Dr. Orlando Swain, who specialises in neurorehabilitation, and I asked him if a pipe organ can contribute to his work.
We all recognise the music has a particular role and a very special role in the recovery after a brain injury. The way music accesses the brain is very direct. Music obviously comes in through the ears, obviously, but it does have a very direct access to the limbic system, which is the emotional centres of the brain, which are a kind of rim around the inside of the brain. And it almost sort of has a very old and prehistoric almost root to the emotional centres of the brain. And we can see, you can demonstrate very rapid and widespread changes in emotional states and in the neurotransmitters that mediate emotion and general arousal with music.
Do you think the organ, though, given the way that it has such a breadth of tonalities, we've got the very low pedal notes, we've got all of the orchestral sounds, really a range of frequencies, do you think that the brain would respond to that differently to perhaps other forms of music?
I suppose what's different about the organ perhaps is the kind of the vibration aspect of it. There's a rather physical aspect, particularly in the lower registers, obviously, where in the same way as if you ever go to a nightclub, to a dub reggae night, you feel the bass in your sternum. Similarly with an organ, you feel almost a sort of physical vibration. And so there is a kind of somatosensory aspect to it.
But presumably a nightclub's going to give you a different, or would it not, than hearing this organ in this chapel?
Well, it depends on the nightclub, I think. But yes, of course, it's a very, very different experience overall. I suppose what I'm getting at is there is a physical sensation aspect to an organ, where in the lower registers you feel that vibration in your body physically, which is a bit similar to that strong bass line I'm describing. So that's another aspect which you wouldn't get with other instruments, I suppose, that sort of physical sensation. So I think that is a little bit different. Organs obviously have a very religious association, and many patients who come through will have some exposure to it, whether through school or through church. So there is that association as well, which is a whole different aspect. It might tap into memories and associations which people have come to before their brain injury, which an organ will particularly access.
And are you actually using music in any part of your clinical trials here?
Yes, we actually do have currently running one of the first clinical trials in rehabilitation. So we've had funding kindly from UCLH Charities, and we're working with Nordoff Robbins with a music therapist. It's a controlled trial, so we're giving patients a block of music therapy versus a control intervention. But we're hoping to see an additional effect of music therapy over and above what we provide already. Anecdotally, we know that particularly patients who have language difficulty, where communication is very difficult, it's hard to access their mental state, it's hard to know what's going on and to communicate to them as well. And that can be very difficult in a rehabilitation setting for a therapist who's trying to work with a patient. But some patients we've had who have been very stuck in that way, where we find communication very hard. It's really been music therapy that's unlocked them in a way. If they suddenly respond emotionally and even in a very practical sense to music therapy, and they'll suddenly start doing things they've never done before. They'll suddenly start to understand the point of what they're doing. And for a few patients, it's really kind of unlocked their therapy for us. And we know it's good for mood and it promotes motivation. So we're hoping to see a positive effect overall in our patient group with the music therapy, but it remains to be seen. And
would you be able to use this organ? I mean, is this organ actually a very good practical resource here?
Yes, I think that we could certainly incorporate the organ into that trial. Obviously, patients come with a range of historical exposure to music and emotional associations with it, and that's not all going to be organs, obviously. So I think for some patients, that certainly may well be an organ. For others, it won't be, but it's good to have that as part of the range that we can use.
Having worked as an organist in 3 different hospital chapels during his career, Chris Batchelor is passionate about having music in hospitals, particularly live organ music, which he believes can have a profound impact on people's mood and well-being, and even a feeling of inward mobility. I can see you were getting completely carried away already then. What goes through your mind? What are you feeling when you're doing that? Does it give you a rest? Does it give you a break? Or does it actually energise you in terms of managing your condition?
I think the latter, actually.
Energising?
Yeah. It's difficult to pull these things together, isn't it, really? But, I think it is energising, actually.
But when you're practicing here, do you get reactions from patients or staff who come in here?
Yes.
What do they say?
Some are very, very positive indeed. I was very surprised. And I have yet to come across anybody who says, I don't like that, thank you. So I think that's pretty positive, isn't it?
Positive for you as well?
Yeah.
So what are you hoping now will be the long-term use of this organ in this chapel?
I hope other people will take it on, actually. It's finding people who are interested enough to come in, get to know the organ and engage others. That's really important.
And for Diana Scarrett from the Friends of the University College London Hospitals, leading the fundraising effort for the restoration has opened the door to further possibilities.
For us, it's one of the biggest things we've ever done, but we really think it's great. We talk about the therapeutic value of the organ, but actually having an organ having an organist playing in the chapel, people can just wander in, staff, you know, that's relaxing. So one of the good things that we've been able to do is work with the Arts and Heritage team in the hospital, who are running a sort of booking system. So if you're an organist and you'd be interested in playing this organ, you can get in touch with them and they'll book you in. And we hope that there'll be a lot of free music coming in from organists just wanting to come and try the organ out.
Presumably it's unusual these days to have a pipe organ in the middle of a hospital.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is very special.
Every hospital needs one.
There we go, that's your next mission. Chris Batchelor, thank you ever so much indeed for your time today. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much.
Now, the organ is mentioned in the Bible 4 times. Once in Genesis, twice in Job, and of course famously in Psalm 150. Now, of course, translation is key here as to whether these references are for an actual pipe organ or used as a term for a collection of instruments. But there are also various interpretations of references in the Jewish Talmud, which suggest there could have been an organ of some sort in the Second Temple itself. But despite all of this, the role of the pipe organ to accompany worship in Judaism has had a very small and checkered history, to say the least. It wasn't really until the 19th century, with the reform movement of Judaism in certain countries, that it began to make a definite appearance. So I was fascinated to learn that there's a 4-manual Harrison and Harrison organ at the West London Synagogue. I went there to meet its director of music, Richard Hills, to find out the role of this organ in synagogue worship and the style of repertoire used. Well, Richard, before we go and have a look at the organ, it's probably worth just describing where we are, because the synagogue, it is an extraordinary fusion. I'm looking at marbled pillars. We've got balcony going around on all 3 sides. And at the centre of attention, everybody is facing behind, I suppose that's where you put the ark, that's where the Torah scrolls are kept, this curtain of gold pipes, which is your domain.
That's right. It's an incredible building, isn't it? It seats about 1,000 people. It was built in 1870, and it's this incredible mix of slightly Byzantine domes and pillars and stencils and colours. It's a riot of colour. And then, as you say, we have the Ark, which is the enclosure where the scrolls are kept, the Torah scrolls, in front of which is the bima, as we call it, which is the stage, for want of a better term, for where the service is led. We also have a pulpit, a marble pulpit to the right-hand side. And there's also a very ornate screen, which we refer to as the choir screen, because behind it, around the 4-manual organ console, sit our professional choir.
I assume I'm right in saying pretty unique, because I know in America the idea of having a pipe organ in a synagogue, in Reformed synagogues certainly, would be quite familiar. In Britain, I think I'm right in thinking not so.
Yes, and while there's always an exception to the rule, I'm sure, but as far as I'm aware, we are now the only synagogue left in the UK with a real pipe organ. There are some digital organs around, but this one's been here in one form or another since 1870. And
it's a full musical tradition. I mean, this is... there's never a moment's rest for you when you're working here.
Oh, you certainly could say that, yes. And on a typical Saturday morning, there are 23 choral items to get through, and there are about 13 or 14 on a Friday night as well. Now, not all of those are extensive. Of course, some of them are a 4 or 8 bar response, but you certainly can't fall asleep. You have to be on your toes.
Well, let's even go behind the screen, and you can introduce the organ to us.
Certainly.
Well, here we are in your domain, in front of a 4-manual 55 stop.
Yes, that's right.
And your services, so the busy time for you is Friday, you've got the Shabbat services, and Saturday, the Sabbath.
Yes, that's right. On a Friday night, we have what we call Erev Shabbat, so the eve of Shabbat, where the idea is that we welcome the Sabbath in and recognise that that is upon us. And then the Saturday morning Shabbat service is all about the Torah and the procession of the Torah. And of course, there are musical elements that are common to both services, but there are also some which are individual.
Well, can we switch the organ on? Can you show me kind of what it does? Because I'm fascinated to know what an organ does, even one that looks as familiar as a Harrison organ, what it does. when it's doing its duty in a synagogue?
Certainly. Well, I've just flipped the switch, so the blower is doing its magic. But while that's coming up to full pressure, we can see that to anyone sitting at this console, it's a very familiar sight. It's a 4-manual Harrison and Harrison console, which dates from 1908.
So peak Harrison golden age, really.
Yes, that's
that
right.
Arthur Harrison himself might have graced the pipes, perhaps, of this.
Perhaps so. And the organ is a kind of classic Harrison mixture of things, if you'll forgive the pun. So the original organ, built in 1870, was a Gray and Davidson, and there are still a lot of pipes from the Gray and Davidson organ in this instrument. In 1908, which is when this rebuild was done by Harrison and Harrison, they kept a lot of stuff. They moved a few things around. They added some of those Harrison specialities, added a solo division, which wasn't there before. They somewhere managed to find space to cram in a solo organ. And we've ended up with this instrument, which has remained, apart from being rebuilt, of course, very much as it was in 1908 in terms of its specification and scope.
So what do you do with it? Because I know you're a man of many talents. You also have a job on a Sunday at St Mary Bourne Street, a very Anglo-Catholic, I think, tradition there. When you're here playing this organ, what are you doing? Is it different?
It is different, of course, in terms of the repertoire, but the interesting thing is that this synagogue is unique, I think I'm right in saying, in its choral heritage. When the community was being established back in the 1840s, they wanted to try and get away from any divisions between the Ashkenazi Jews and the Sephardi Jews who were in the country at the time. And so they wanted to create something that was unique to them, and that's exactly what they did. And in fact, the first director of music here and organist, wonderful name Charles Garland Verinder, Dr. Verinder, was a chorister at Salisbury, and he was an articled pupil to Elvey at St George's Chapel, Windsor Castle, and he was the director of music at the synagogue. He moved with the community to this new building in 1870, and he and his successors really wrote a lot of the core repertoire which we still use today. And so quite a lot of it does sound quite Anglican, and I think I'm allowed to say that because the whole point of assimilating and creating something new was adopting a certain British identity to the liturgical music. So we do choral settings of psalms that wouldn't sound out of place in a Victorian cathedral. Would you believe we sing psalms to Anglican chant from time to time?
I wouldn't believe that. That surprises me.
Well, again, I often laugh that in my other work, of course, mainly these days, I work with plain chant, certainly in the Anglo-Catholic sphere, and so I find it rather amusing that the only place I encounter Anglican chant on a regular basis is at the synagogue. The sound of singing those famous Barnby and chants of that ilk.
I mean, it's literally we're at the Anglican chant.
Very much so, yes, absolutely. But we sing the psalms in Hebrew to those chants, and that has to be unique to us. I can't imagine that anywhere else would be doing that sort of thing.
We should establish that this is a Reformed synagogue. If we were in an Orthodox synagogue, certainly no pipe organ, no instrumental music, there's vocal music. Are you representing any tradition of Reform Jewish music?
Well, I think the answer to that is that we have a core repertoire that was established from about 1859 up until the early part of the last century by our first directors of music. But since then, we've expanded the repertoire to include some of the great continental composers, Lewandowski being an obvious example of that, pupil of Mendelssohn famously, Sulzer, Salomone de Rossi. And so we have taken our core and broadened it rather than changing it. But at the heart of it is still that slightly Victorian repertoire, choral sound world that was established by Dr. Verinder and the people who were working with the synagogue choir at the time.
So there's kind of a Jewish core, a Jewish framework, but with perhaps Anglican decoration.
Yes, or you could say there was an Anglican core with Jewish decoration. I mean, it depends on.
Which one is that? Yeah.
It depends on which way you look at it.
It's
now,
an assimilation. That's the point.
Absolutely, yeah, and I don't mean that to disrespect either party. It's very much an assimilation of both kinds to create something which is uniquely West London.
Let's talk about the daily functions. I mean, do you do things? You set the mood. Are you improvising before the start of a service? Are the congregation singing hymns? What are the choir doing? How does it all work? How do you use this organ?
Well, a lot of the work of the organ is very much in common with what you would hear done down the road at St Mary's Bourne Street. So you would be accompanying the choral items, you would be accompanying the congregation, and there are congregational songs that we would sing. I mean, we don't call them hymns as such, but some of them have a certain strophic character to them, which would sound very familiar to somebody who was worshipping in that context. Yes, there's a lot of pre- and post-service improvisation, that sort of thing.
How do you introduce a Shabbat service on a Friday? When people are coming in, what do they hear?
So here's something that might sound familiar if you were going into a cathedral, perhaps. This is the swell strings and the 32-foot pedal flue. We're very lucky to have a full-length pedal flue. This might be setting the scene. So some very typical Harrison-style colours.
And we're right in the body of the organ here. You can tell, aren't you? We're right.
Oh yes, yeah. There's no hiding in here. Everything is right up front. But likewise, there are some wonderful characteristic flutes. There's an unusual number of flute sounds. So just on the choir, for example, we have 3 different kinds and scales of flute. There's the classic clarabelle, a gedect. Curiously named Spitz flute, which has a very kind of principal-like character to it. And if we're doing soloing out for certain melodies, we might use one of the big flutes on the grate. This is the whole flute. And for choral accompaniment, the usual colourful but fairly neutral stop diapason type of sound. And then if I move up onto the swell, we've got a kind of classic leather diapason that you would expect here in many a Harrison organ, and this is great for accompanying the choir, which incidentally stands around the console on these raised platforms. So it's an accompanist's dream, really, because there's absolutely no discrepancy in timing between what you play and what you hear. So here's some swell sounds. Oboe sound, which is very useful for accompanying. And there's this very useful choir division, which is unenclosed, and it sits right in the middle of the case, above where the singers sit. And that has the usual combination of strings and flues, and even a mixture, a dulciana mixture, which we use a lot for choral accompaniment. So here's some stringy sounds for you. Classic kind of sound.
There are a lot of strings here. I mean, I don't know whether there's something intentionally behind this organ, but I'm noticing the great, your sort of big foundation stops seem to be sort of Geigen orientated. I mean, is there something distinctive about that with this particular organ, or are we still very much general? This could be anywhere.
I think we're very much general, although of course we're within the aesthetic of the period where we're still thinking very orchestrally, and so there are a lot of colourful stringy diapasons, and even that flute that I just played you has a certain sort of stringy edge to it. And all of these sounds are very useful, as you know, in choral accompaniment work. But having said that, we have all the sort of bigger guns that you might expect, including 3 different scales of diapason on the grate. So yes, we do have Geigen, a small open, and a big large open as well. So that kind of core English foundation. Much of the chorus work, incidentally, is based on the Gray and Davison pipework from 1870. And then, in common with organs of the period, we have the luxury of 3 reeds on the grate, 16, 8 and 4 trombas, sound like this. In the 1930s, Harrison's added harmonic trebles to the swell reeds, so they now sound a little bit more like you would expect, a little bit brighter, a bit more harmonic development, like this. There are some lovely colours which occasionally I will use in accompanying some of the repertoire. So here's the Vox Humana on the swell. Also without added piccolo. And who could forget the kind of classic Harrison solo organ? So up on the 4th keyboard, we have an orchestral oboe. Which sounds quite remote here at the console, but it really develops out in the room. Corno di bassetto, and a full-blooded, good old-fashioned Harrison & Harrison high-pressure tuba. Sounds like this. I might use that to accompany the procession of the Torah scrolls, for example.
In terms of what you have to do with this functionally on a Friday and a Saturday, do you need all these sounds? What's the real functional purpose here? How much of all of these stops do you use?
Well, the congregational items, of which there is usually a song, at least, or two, both on a Friday night and a Saturday morning, will use the chorus work and some of the larger pedal stops, just as you would in a churchy environment, to support the congregational singing. A lot of the colours actually do come into play with the choral accompaniments, because we have a lot of Victoriana, for want of a better term, which calls for those colours, and a lot of the scores that we use, which were written by Dr. Veringer in the early days and his successors, call for certain colours to be used. They might say clarabelle, or they might say clarinet, or...
But is the overall character here, am I thinking that there's a sort of a Jewish sound? Are you encountering a different style of music by your work here? Because I'm assuming if it's Reform Judaism, we're in the compositional realm of 19th century Germany, the Eastern Europe area. Would that be right? I mean, do you think there's a distinctive character to the music that you play here?
Well, there's certainly a certain soundscape that anyone who would be worshipping in a synagogue on the continent might be familiar with. For example, one of the songs that we sing on a Friday night, which is called Shalom Aleichem, sounds like this. Now, we have a choral version of that, and again, the harmonies are very...
Is that congregational? Familiar. Everybody sings that?
They will sing that, yes, that's right, but the choir will sing their harmony parts. So that's an example of something which sounds like it could belong in the continent as well, but being given the Harrison treatment. So, yeah, a lot of what you will be discovering is that there's much more similarity between the two strands than you might think.
One thing I'm slightly confused about is all the words you're using here, this is in Hebrew. The choir sing in Hebrew, the congregation sing in Hebrew. What I know of Hebrew is that you read and write it from right to left. What everybody knows about music is that you read that from left to right. There's a problem here.
Well, yes, believe it or not, I have actually seen music written in original Hebrew with the music going right to left.
Is that a thing? You read music
I have seen
the other way around?
but we don't do it here, thank goodness. No. We read from left to right the musical scores in the usual way, and the Hebrew is handily transliterated for us. Now, that's not to say that doesn't come with its own problems, because of course there's no standard transliteration for a lot of these things, and so one of the jobs of the choir master here is to make sure that there's a house style, that all of the transliterations are the same for the similar vowel sounds across the various repertoire that we do, so that it makes it quite familiar for the choir to stand up and be able to sight read a lot of it, because of course we do have the usual London deputy singers coming in and singing for services, and they need to know that what they're going to do from one week to the next is consistent.
Well, presumably that's opened musical doors for you, because I suspect there's a parallel world of repertoire of music that you wouldn't be able to encounter unless you were working in this environment.
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. There is a lot of repertoire that we have brought into our own repertoire to join that core repertoire that was written by our founding directors of music. We've also grown our repertoire to include a lot of the great continental composers like Sulzer and Lewandowski.
But these are people writing for Reformed Jewish liturgical music. That's the point, really.
Yes.
Some of this is difficult to find because, of course, the events of the 20th century, the Holocaust, some of this music you're actually rediscovering, as it were.
Some of it, absolutely. We are, for example, looking at a project at the moment exploring the works of a Ukrainian Jewish composer who was alive in the 19th century, and a lot of that music has just been absolutely forgotten, and we had to find it in libraries and on microfiche and all that kind of stuff, and do new editions and to introduce it back, because yes, that has been lost. But a lot of the repertoire did make it over here, and so we now find ourselves continuing the tradition of stuff that was lost on the continent in some regards, yes. Some of those aforementioned composers that feature in our weekly services, perhaps you might not even hear now in the countries in which they were originally written. Gosh. So we're perpetuating quite a big tradition here. We've got our own at the core, which is the sort of slightly more Anglican sound world, and we're also adding to it and mixing in with it, assimilating with it, this continental style of music, which is all very much in the same kind of 19th century sound world, but nevertheless it was written by Jewish composers for use in reform movement on the continent.
But at the heart of all of this, is there intrinsically a Jewish sound, a Jewish character that has somehow sustained through many centuries of musical expression?
I think that if you were to ask that question to most Jewish musicians, they would probably say that the sound world that comes to mind immediately is that very modally minor kind of sound that you heard in that piece that I demonstrated a little bit earlier, this sort of... that sort of very... it's all very... yeah, that sort of minor modal sound world, it does go through quite a lot of music.
And do you encounter that then in the stuff you're doing? So when you've got your choir items, or when you're, accompanying the congregation, is that something you find is still very present here, that your ear is not attuned to when you're down the road at St Mary's?
Yeah, that is something that we could say is a sound world that we hear here very often. Having said that, of course, I alluded to the fact that there are quite a lot of crossovers, and one of the things that I was really fascinated to find when I came here is that one of the songs that we do quite a lot on a Friday night is a song called Yigdal, and the melody for that we use sounds like this.
Now that sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
That's a jolly version of, O God of Abraham.
The God of Abraham praise. That's right. Yes.
Now, hang on a bit. Wait. Now, have you pinched that from the Anglicans, or what?
Well, I'm pretty sure that the name of it in the New English Hymnal, the name of the tune that's used for the God of Abraham praise that I've just played, is called Yigdal, and it's a melody that we call Leone. So I think it was the other way around. I think that the Anglicans pinched it and sort of anglicised it a bit, made it a bit slower, made it a little bit more intricate in its inner.
So that's an original Jewish melody that is going the other way into the Anglican Church.
That's right.
You mentioned earlier that the Psalms. I'm curious. Obviously, in Judaism, Psalms are front and centre of most things. Mm-hmm. Give me an example of when your choir is doing a psalm. Mm-hmm. Actually, what does it sound like when you're doing it here in a synagogue?
Okay. Well, psalm settings of the psalms in whatever guise are a major part of what we do here musically, as you might expect. And some of them are slightly more free form. They take the form of a composition, a through composed piece. Some of them are very much strophic, like hymns would be. So, for example, our setting written by Dr. Verinder of Psalm 121, which is a psalm close to my own heart, of course, I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills, sounds like this. Which sounds very hymn-like.
Yes, and everybody sings that.
And everybody sings that. We have a setting of Psalm 24, when the scrolls are returned to the Ark, and we might have a setting of that by Mombach, which sounds like this. So it's, again, and that's sung chorally, but that has the sense of a song about it. Or we might just as well, if we're doing Psalm 24, do this. Which is the classic Anglican Barnby chant set for that psalm in the Cathedral Psalter.
So you really do everything.
We really do everything, from Anglican chant up to slightly more folk-influenced music. And of course, it would be remiss of me to suggest that the repertoire here is in any way old-fashioned or a timepiece, because we are still expanding, and some of the music that we are doing now is incorporating a certain amount of the klezmer folk music that would be very familiar
where do you think you fit in with what you do here with global Reform Judaism?
Well, again, it comes back to the idea that what we do here is unique. I really can't think of another synagogue in the world that combines quite such a Anglican choral sound world with the continental sound world of Jewish composers.
And is that looked favourably upon? I mean, are there accusations of you Christianising Jewish worship and expression?
Oh yes, of course, and there has been all the way back to the founding of this community, and that's something which, to some degree, I suppose, is still present today. But that's one of the reasons why I'm always keen to point out that the reason that it sounds a bit churchy from time to time is because it's meant to. That was the whole point of creating a music that was British when our forefathers set up this musical tradition. Now, as I've said, we've expanded that so that we are a lot more wide-ranging in our musical style these days. And so it's a criticism that is one that we take in the context of our history, and we think that that's worth championing, but also not treating as a timepiece, and it's the whole inclusivity of doing that which is the important thing.
Is having a 4-manual Harrison organ in a synagogue actually the key to what you were saying, to help that assimilation? Really, this organ is the key to achieving that success.
Yes, it really is, and I'm sure that many people will be listening to this thinking that I was going to demonstrate ways in which we use the organ in a very specifically Jewish way, and the honest answer is there isn't, because the whole core of the repertoire we do here, and the reason for its being established, was to be like the great British cathedral traditions that were very fashionable at the time that our congregation was coming together in the 1860s. And so the organ, being at the centre of our choral worship, is really facilitating that. The purpose of it is not to bring something quirky to something which is very Jewish. It's the other way around. It's to establish, to anchor this very British way of incorporating music and liturgy in this unusual environment.
Well, of course, we mustn't forget, adding to that mix is you, Richard, because apart from the fact that you're director of music at a synagogue, you're also the organist at St Mary's, Bourne Street, down the road, and you have a quite well-established international reputation as being a theatre organist.
That's right.
Really, where is Richard Hills most at home?
Oh, now, goodness me.
And do you bring all three? I mean, do you bring the theatre organ to your job here?
Well, I like to say that there's a lot more in common between all of those styles of music than people like to think. And I've always quipped that playing for a high Anglican church service is very similar to accompanying a silent film. It's the same skill set. You're steering the emotions of a situation. You are picking up on themes. You're joining everything together, hopefully seamlessly. And here at the synagogue, I find myself doing exactly the same thing. A Torah procession needs some music to accompany it as they walk the scrolls around the synagogue, just as returning the gospel book in the procession does. It's exactly the same skill set. Likewise, if you are trying to convey the mood of a particular service, if you've got a particularly heavy service in terms of its emotion, then you'll want to create some music and to program choral items which really facilitate that. But likewise, here at the synagogue, we do include a number of slightly more up-to-date settings of things, and some of the theatrical techniques come into play there, and that piece I played you that sounds like the God of Abraham Praise that we call Yigdal, sometimes that can have a very sort of upbeat feel about it. And I think a lot of worship in whichever guise is theatrical, and it should be, because it brings the meaning alive for the person in the pew.
Well, can I put you to the test then? Because I assume when you're improvising a gospel procession, your musical ears might be informing your fingers to do something slightly different harmonically when you're accompanying the Torah scrolls. Have you got something to just give us another flavour of the organ here and the sort of music that we would encounter?
Okay, I'll see what I can do for you.
Richard Hills, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, that's all for now. Next time, I talk to the American concert organist, Caitlin Emerson. And Andy Scott, head voicer and managing director at Harrison & Harrison, takes me on a tour around the Harrison workshop in Durham, looking at the different skills and experience needed to be an organ builder. So until then, from me, Mark O'Brien, goodbye.